Thank you very much. That's right. Very good. I actually started as a mathematician. But, right. It's a great pleasure to be here, to work with Ram and Peter Raven and the Chancellor. In 2016, last year, there was a paper published by a group of geophysicists, environmental scientists in Science, in the journal Science, in which they collated data and reported the time series of 11 biogeochemical signatures that had been observed in ice cores. And they found very similar to carbon concentration, the hockey stick diagram. Flat for centuries, thousands of years, and rising sharply. And interestingly, roughly speaking, the sharp rise in their data set that they were reporting was about the middle of the last century. That is, just after the war. And of course, they suggested that the Anthropocene should be seen as having arrived about mid-20th century, 1950 or so. Amongst economists, my tribe, as it were, the period from 1950 to about the end of the 1970s is widely known as the golden age of capitalism. It was the period when the Far East, the tigers as we used to call them, grew at a furious rate, a desirable rate, and the West developed large numbers of improvements recorded large numbers of improvements in the human condition, so that we live a lot longer, we're better educated, we eat healthier, and for good reason, economists have focused on that to say that this has been a very rich period. If you work out the increase in human activity, and you think that that's correlated with all the improvements that we talk about and are rightly proud of, I'm talking now globally on average. Of course, there are inequalities. I'm ignoring now the fact that many countries haven't grown as fast. If you concentrate on that, on human activity, then the recorded GDP, global GDP, has grown 15 times over the 65-year period from 1950 to 2015. It's never happened before. It's a historical blip, outlier out there. To the extent you think that might affect our economic activity bears on the biosphere, to that extent, of course, the two observations I've just now made, one from the journal Science and the Economist Golden Age of Capitalism, they mesh very nicely, except one is pointing down and the other is pointing up. We economists, my tribe, that is not I personally, look at the upward sign, and we are here today because we are looking at the downward sign, which are deeply related. So then how can we intellectually get the two together? The reason we economists have ignored or not noticed the tension between these two directions is that the measures that we use to judge the performance of economies and the performance of societies essentially ignores nature, the biosphere. I need only to point out that GDP, for example, the most common measure that we use, does not have any depreciation of the capital assets of our economy. It's gross domestic product, it's not net. So that you could increase GDP by mining the biosphere, which is what we have been doing, because the data on the biosphere, as I said in the Science paper, is that it's being degraded. So question arises as to two things. How has this come about, this enormous disconnect between our own aims, the human aims, as expressed through sometimes democratic institutions, very often non-democratic institutions, and the biosphere of which we humans are an integral part. We tend to forget, and we do not educate our children to recognize that we are actually a part of the biosphere. We are not outside it. We are very much inside it and have actually evolved with it, as was pointed out in the previous lecture. And the reason here is from the institutional side, the fact that the biosphere is largely free to be used. We do not price it. Now, you might say it should not be priced because it's invaluable. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that on a daily basis, if you have a free good out there, then you're going to mine it. You're not going to economize on cheap things. You're going to economize on expensive things. And that involves also the direction of technological change. And I want to make one brief remark on it, which is, it is true that we've had huge technological improvements over the past 200 years. Notice that the time scale I'm looking at is a blip compared to the time scale that Dr. Arbour was addressing. I'm only looking at now the last 65 years or so because that's where, in some sense, the action is. The direction of technological change has been, on the whole, rather rapacious in the use of nature. And the reason is, again, rather easy to see. Entrepreneurs or innovators are going to, again, economize on those goods which are expensive, not those goods which are cheap. And if nature is cheap at the marketplace, quote unquote, why then, of course, we're going to be moving in that direction. Some of it is unintended. So, for example, the carbon problem, the fact that steam engine, it wasn't biased in that sense because at that time there was no need necessarily to think of it being rapacious on the use of nature. That recognition has come much later, the fact that carbon is, at the margin, bad news, at least today. On the other hand, when you think of the chainsaw, or you think of sonar technology for identifying schools of fish, then you know that it's going to be rapacious. The chainsaw relieves us of energy need to cut down trees. On the other hand, you can mow down acres and acres of forest without much sweat, the bulldozer and the chainsaw. So these are examples of the biased direction of technological change. And if you ignore the fact that Mother Nature is being carved out or degraded, then of course these innovations look extremely good because they save on energy, you can do many more things, enjoy a better life, and so forth. So we economists use the expression externalities in our actions. These are unrecorded, unaccounted for consequences for others of our activities, which are in some sense enable us to explain why you have this conflict between the upward and the downward movements of life's experiences over the past years. My allusion to technology is this. The reason I alluded to it is this, that in one sense, as a social scientist, I feel perhaps our emphasis on the carbon problem, on global climate change, has directed us towards technological solutions. This is one area where there is probably, you would say, well, if carbon emission is at the margin a bad thing, you want to find sources of energy which are carbon neutral. In a paper that the Chancellor, Dr. Ramanathan, and myself published a couple of years ago, we pointed out that most of the problems that we'll be studying here are not exclusively of a technological kind. We really require institutional change, but the driver of institutional change has to come from within us, our motivations, our aspirations, and the kind of life we want to lead. So then, if there is a conflict between, if you like, the kinds of measures that we use to study the progress and regress of nations and the experience of environmental scientists in recording what we are doing to the biosphere, how should we refashion the way we study economies? Well, in a series of papers over the past 20 years, a number of us have shown that instead of ad hoc indicators, including GDP, what ideally we should be studying is the wealth of nations. Now, that looks extremely technocratic, but in fact, there is a proposition that can be proved. You start with human well-being as the goal, And human well-being, not only today's human well-being, tomorrow's, our children's, our grandchildren's, our great-grandchildren's, and so forth. Howsoever you wish to think of it. You could be an Aristotelian, you could be an utilitarian. It doesn't really matter. If you're concerned with today and the future as to the human condition, then there exists a way of estimating the value of the stocks of assets that we have inherited, and we track the value of that stock over time to see whether the aggregate stock is increasing or declining. The proposition that I want to, I see, here we go. I don't know if you can read it, but you have the paper here, and I'm going to read the proposition to you, and I'm going to proceed from there. The proposition says, any change to an economy that increases social well-being, and by that I mean intergenerational, including your children, grandchildren, and so forth, across the generations raises this measure wealth. Similarly, any change that lowers social well-being across the generations reduces that wealth. So it's a very useful result because it's telling us what object we ought to be studying and tracking over time to see whether an economy is improving or not in terms of human well-being. I talk about the stocks. What are these stocks? These results that I mentioned pointed to three that we ought to simultaneously include. One is reproducible capital, buildings, roads, all the hardware that we see, hospitals, you name it, schools, and so forth. That's called reproducible capital. And in fact, it's that capital which is mostly studied in national income accounts. So when you read about an economy making 5% investment of its GDP, it's that expenditure, the expenditure towards reproducible capital that you read mostly, okay? The other is human capital. My colleagues in the United States, when they think of human capital, they think in terms of education. Are we better educated? So the measures of human capital are that way directed. But some of us, including colleagues in colleagues in the United States, think of health as part of human capital. If health is not a part of human capital, it's hard to know what human capital could mean. So I'll include health, of course, and I'll come back to that towards the end of my talk, or rather at the end of my talk, to how to measure this health. And the third is, of course, natural capital, the biosphere, the thing that's missing in much economic discussion. So the idea is to try and place a value on each of these and then aggregate them to create the notion of wealth, and then track wealth or per capita wealth and see whether things are improving or deteriorating. Notice the move that we are making. We are moving from a notion of human well-being to a notion which, of course, picks up notions of human well-being because the valuation that you impute to these stocks of capital depends on your notion of human well-being. So if you're an Aristotelian, the value you might place on human capital may be slightly different from if you were a utilitarian. No question about it. Values cannot be ignored. They are very much embedded on it. So when I say wealth, don't think of it as a market value, okay? It incorporates our social values, all right? And that's probably why it's going to be very difficult to persuade governments to move towards wealth accounts, because they will say, look, market prices are tangible. We can handle it, and therefore we're going to stick to it. But the proposal that we have been making, and I did with the Indian government, was to have a parallel estimates of wealth accounts to see how they conform to national accounts. So now I want to talk about health as a component of wealth. Notice I said a component, but that's because humans need more than just good health. There are many other things that we care about, the activities, the friendships, all the things that make for a flourishing life. We want to be able to include them. And those are managed through the nature as well as the produced capital that we construct. So the idea of wealth being health being a component of wealth shouldn't strike you as being odd. It's just question is, how important is a measure of health in wealth? And I'll come to that in the last 5-10 minutes that I have. You will see that any estimate that we make, the theory is tight, by the way, I should tell you. It's not controversial. These are theorems, mathematical theorems, and either they're wrong or they're right, and they've passed all the usual tests of refereeing and so forth, and they're now about 20 years old, these theorems, so we're not discussing the legitimacy of the theorems. When you apply the theorem, notice the proposition is an if and only if kind of statement, so it has no empirical implication in the sense that it has no empirical content, but it has a huge empirical implication because it's telling us what we should measure, which is wealth. I should say at once that any estimates of wealth are going to be shot through with errors. No ifs and buts about it. I'm fully aware of that. Far more error than those of you who are particle physicists, for example, if there are any here, where you have accuracies of unimaginably high accuracy. When you have very, very imperfect data, and so much of these data are actually influenced by your value system, then I have found one very useful feature to look for, which is bias. Biased results are very useful because if you know the direction of the bias, and having noted the direction of your bias in your estimates, if the estimate is still very substantial, then you say, well, if I were to correct for the bias, it'll be even more important. So I want you to bear that in mind when I give you the results, to just an illustration of how numbers come through. The way I'm going to value health, this is a paper that was published about 5 years ago by Professor Kenneth Arrow, who is a very distinguished founding member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Science, a giant of the social sciences who died earlier this year at the age of 95. But I was one of the co-authors too, and that's why I want to report on it. I'm going to value, you might say, well, how do we think of health and its benefits? There are at least 3 benefits, or 3 aspects of health that we care about. One, it improves our current well-being. If you have a headache, you feel bad, and that's bad. That's a flow. The headache may go, but currently you're not feeling so good, or if you have a fever. 2, productivity. If you're not well, you can't work. You can't do when I say work, I mean you can't do the things that you care to do. Even friendship becomes hard. You would tell them, leave me alone, I want to get well before I can engage in the party that we're thinking of. And 3, it increases our life expectancy. Fortunately, at a very rough level, these 3 are correlated. And I'm going to immediately give you a biased result because we have very little data on how to do the first 2. Well, we have some, but we have partial. We can't use it really at a national level, at least with the kind of conviction that we can have otherwise. We look for life expectancy. Fortunately, there's going to be a biased result because we're ignoring 2, but to the extent they are correlated positively, to that extent we are picking up the other effects as well. Finally, the methods we use to value life expectancy that have been used is the value of a statistical life, and I'm giving you the definition in a second, assumes that the risks of death are independent of one another. And the whole point about this conference is that they're correlated. We're looking at health risks that may be contagious. All right, so there's another bias coming along. So the idea of a value of a statistical life is the benefit to you of reducing the risk of death by a unit. All right, and that was the this slide. I'm now going to give you if you open my paper, because I can see that it's hard to read, the last page of the paper has this table, which gives an estimate of the movement of per capita wealth in India over the period 1995-2000, a 5-year period, and we want to see whether there was an increase in wealth per capita over this 5-year period in India. That includes these 3 types of capital assets that we mentioned. I can now finish by just pointing out, if you look at the table, although still I'd like to finish on time so we can have some responses if there is any. It's the remarkable finding, at least to me, was there have been some parallel findings, but they were in terms of income, not wealth. If you look at the table for India, we did 5 countries in that paper, by the way, but I chose India because that's where I come from, so I have a bias. And it's a poor country that has an advantage, and I'll show you in a minute why. The first row is reproducible capital. We estimate 1995 stock in 2000. Take the difference, that's the change, that's the third column, change over, and that's $650 per person, and then you can also compute the growth rate. All right, so reproducible capital increased. Education improved. The value of education, $6,420 in 1995, increased to $7,440, and so forth. But now look at, in the 4th row is natural capital, extremely biased. It's biased simply because only a few pieces of natural capital are included in this particular estimate. Fisheries were not because there were no data. Forests were valued only in terms of the timber they have. Nothing of all the ecosystem services that they offer. So this is extremely biased, all right? Okay, but notice, nevertheless, when it comes to human capital, and the appendix in the paper shows you how we estimated the human capital using the value of a statistical life, it's 2 orders of magnitude greater than all the others combined. It's absolutely remarkable because people value life hugely. And in a democratic society, that ought to be recorded. Even in a poor country like India, the content of human capital, or health capital, if you like, life expectancy, as measured in life expectancy, is 2 orders of magnitude bigger than anything else. All right? Recognizing that natural capital has been hugely undervalued here. And I do not know what the value of natural capital would be in this estimate if we could do it properly. Okay? All right, if you take these into account, and if you ignore row 8, then we are looking at not a very comfortable position. The wealth per capita in India over this 5-year period hardly grew. If you ignore the row 8, and I'll tell you in discussion time, if you ask me why I would recommend we ignore 8, I will come to that. On the other hand, this is a period when India grew in terms of GDP per capita at a rather high level rate. So you can see GDP and wealth do not move in the same direction. If the economic activity plunders the biosphere, then GDP might go up, and typically would go up, but it'll be at the expense of mining your natural capital. Whereas wealth, of course, would not allow you to do that because you'd be valuing the decline in the value of natural capital, which that negative amount would be added to your wealth estimates so that the net growth in wealth would be that much lower. So, as I say, to sum up, health seems to be to the extent that you can trust these numbers, at least they're giving you some sense of what might be going on, health seems to be, even in the crude way that we economists like to measure health, seems to be absolutely dominant in the wealth of nations. And again, as I say, it's probably a biased result. It's biased. That and natural capital are both biased downwards, not upwards. And that should be a salutary observation. Thank you very much.